Welcome to the Thought Leader Podcast. Get ready to hear powerful stories, unique perspectives, and bright ideas to impact the world in the areas of health, wealth, and relationships. We interview experts, authors, executives, entrepreneurs, and other industry thought leaders who share new strategies, practical tools, and best practices to accelerate your personal and professional results. This is the Thought Leader Podcast. And now, here's your host, Elena Fernandez.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Thought Leader Podcast. Here we are with a dear friend. He's going to introduce himself to you in a second, but let me just tell you something about this fantastic teacher. He is an MD clinical professor of psychiatry, but he's also a 43-year Zen Buddhist practitioner. He's a former neuropsychology doctoral student and brain researcher with a PhD in natural health science. But what we're going to be talking today about is how we experience emotional crisis and life stress and chronic unhappiness. And Jeff is the guy to know for that. So welcome. I'm so honored to be interviewing you today. I have been looking forward to this moment for months now.
Wow, that's great. That makes me feel good.
Yeah, so why don't you tell our audience a little bit about who you are and a little bit of your journey?
So I was interested when I was in high school in consciousness because I was reading a psychology textbook. And the author at one point said, isn't it amazing how the human brain is really just ultimately a collection of chemicals? You know, it's very organized, but if really ultimately it's just that, but it can wake up and know it's alive. And that was like, wow, I was really fascinated by that thought. And I kept thinking about it. And I really had a burning desire to be a psychologist and study consciousness. And then actually about the same year, my parents took us on a tour of some, like a hospital ship, a medical hospital ship. And I had this really burning desire to be a doctor and travel around the world and deliver medical care. And at some point, months later, it dawned on me that I could be a psychiatrist and kind of do both, which turns out to really have been neither, but it set me on my course to be a psychiatrist. And then to kind of move it back a little bit during my residency, I was in a doctorate program in neuropsychology where we studied the brain and did brain research. And so I was in that program for almost the 4 years of my residency, although I did all the coursework, but I didn't stay for the dissertation because it wasn't interesting what they wanted me to work on.
I love that clarity, right?
Yeah. So, actually to kind of put it together, so I had started thinking about the brain and I started doing Buddhism in 1980. And, I was already kind of finishing college, but just the two things started to dawn on me that they were that meditation and enlightenment and the suffering that they talked about in Buddhism really was, as far as I was concerned, was completely about the brain and what it is that in the brain that causes suffering to the point of crisis, but also just stress and just everyday unhappiness and dissatisfaction, all the way to higher levels of maturity, wisdom, to the point of even sort of going beyond the self, so to speak, the kind of enlightenment sort of thing. And it's all about the brain and what structures and how the brain is configured. And so that really brought me back to that level of fascination I had when I was in high school. And so I created it evolved into a whole model that I call the SatoriWest Method, that explains those things, and also how to go from any point on one side to any point on the other side. And so the model was meant to be used in like a life club where people join in there for 6 months or at least, or even up to years. They kind of do a deep dive into the method and all the strategies and wellness strategies that are involved in it. But I was the chief medical officer of a few different facilities, and in in one of them, I implemented an inpatient curriculum because I thought, wow, all these patients really need to hear this. So we created group curricula, and then it was pretty successful. And then we did a 3-week long all-day curriculum for people who were not hospitalized but were in intensive outpatient programs.
Wow.
So it was really gratifying. It worked really well.
Wow, that's incredible. And we're going to talk more about that, I'm sure. But for now, I know that you have a theory about what is and what creates suffering. And so I really want you to share it with our audience because I know that it's very profound.
Okay. So there's a continuum or a spectrum. And on the one side, what happens like all animals, from maybe reptiles or amphibians all the way up to primates and us, we have built-in survival wiring that is very potent, very powerful. So when anything comes into our field of experience, or even internally that we need or we want, our brains focus their attention on it. Very simple. And so if you're hungry and you see some food or a chocolate cake, boop, 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 you're going to be paying attention to it. And if you want to avoid something, you're afraid of something, you're going to pay a lot of attention to that. So we pay attention to things like pretty much all day. We go from one thing to another. The weird thing that I think I realized from Buddhism as well as just studying the brain is that in humans, that survival wiring actually, it's good to get us through maybe childhood or even into like teenage years, but ultimately it warps the human mind. It actually changes our reality so that we don't see things clearly and don't see things the way they are. And I call that tunnel vision. It's a very simple word that we all use, but it has a very specific meaning and definition. And so when anything pulls your attention, and so it depends on how strongly it pulls your attention, right? So if you see, someone coming at you and they're threatening, your attention is going to be really locked in there. Whereas if you're just paying attention to a beautiful sunset, then, it'll be locked in, but not so intensely. And it can be anything that grabs your attention. It can be, things you see, things you hear, a loud bang. It could even be your own thoughts and your own feelings, your own imagination even. There's so many things that can grab your attention. And when that happens, it's sort of there's a series of 7 other things. So there's 8 points to tunnel vision. The first is attention, that happen at the same time. But we'll walk through it one at a time because it's really worth knowing this information. But I would point out to you that it was so successful in a psychiatric hospital. We had testimonials that were really amazing because the more something grabs your attention and the more tunnel vision it puts you in, the easier it is to notice it because it's so extreme. So when, your audience is listening to this, you'd have to imagine times. I mean, you can imagine right now, because in some sense, we're all in some degree of tunnel vision, but it's harder because we're so used to it. So try to imagine times that have been a little bit more extreme. So the thing that happens that I can describe next is that it's just like the survival wiring. The more attention you pay to something, though it's like a kind of like a stimulus response kind of thing, is that you start losing control of what you do, so that you become more kind of compulsive or impulsive. Really think things out. You're kind of reacting kind of quickly in that way, which explains a lot of things. I mean, a lot of things, like why people who have diabetes and are overweight, if they stare down a chocolate cake long enough, they're going to eat it. And it explains also why people who have severe substance use disorder and have just gone through horrific consequences, and they think about or imagine, or their attention gets grabbed by maybe some alcohol or whatever, they will eventually, if it grabs their attention long enough and hard enough, they'll wind up drinking it. I don't know if you could experience that, but it's really, I mean, I experience it quite a bit in so many different ways. So the thing that happens after that is that it's kind of obvious, is that when you're focused on kind of one thing or a group of things, so it can be like a piece of chocolate cake, and the thoughts and the feelings you have, it's all kind of one bundle of tunnel vision. The thing that happens next that makes sense is that you're less aware of anything else. So that becomes kind of like your world in many ways. And if you're, say, in crisis, and say you're, I know, Lena, you have a daughter, you say, when she was a teenager, and, if she was out late and you were worried and you were imagining and you were kind of caught up in that.
Yeah.
The world seems smaller. And you start, and it just feels like there aren't many choices. And it's not just that you feel like you're painted in a corner, but there's also like a kind of experiential sense that your world is kind of small, physically smaller. And that has a lot of, every point of tunnel vision is an hour course, is an hour class in the Life Club, and even in the partial hospital program. So the next thing that happens, which is kind of amazing, is that as your world gets smaller and you start losing control, you also start to accept as true things without critical analysis. So, it explains why if there's a really charismatic person who grabs your attention, that you'll start to, believe them and take for truth what they tell you. Even like television commercials, Madison Avenue in trying to get people to buy things, they'll have a television commercial and they'll have a product, but they'll put something on the screen like, a big dinosaur or something, and if it grabs your attention long enough, you'll start to believe what the words are below, in addition to the image. So it explains a lot of things. I mean, that is how I believe hypnosis happens, is that, someone says, stare at this watch, and then eventually you're going to start to believe what they tell you. So you become more kind of gullible, perhaps even suggestible, I think is a more fair word. That's really important to understand.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the fifth thing that happens is that these are kind of artificial separations, is that you kind of get really dragged into your imagination, into your head more. Even if it's something in your imagination that's grabbing your attention, you start to imagine the moment as much as you are living in it.
Yeah.
So, you kind of project your own biases and kind of, memories on what's happening around you, so that, at a certain point, and we do this all day long. It's like we live in our expectations, and, and we judge people based on, our expectations of them, instead of just starting fresh each moment and seeing, and also you don't forget what your experience is, but it doesn't control you. It doesn't become the dominant way that you see things. So jump in anytime you want.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that last thing you said, because it's kind of a tricky balance. So do you have any examples of that part? So you don't forget your lived experience, but you also don't let that experience dominate what you're going to do or think or feel about that. So I definitely think that's fascinating. Tell us more about that.
Well, if we have time to talk about the opposite of tunnel vision, it'll become
Yeah.
a little clearer what that means. But in a sense, when you have tunnel vision, it's like if like you're worried about your daughter coming home late, which I have been with my kids, and fantasizing stuff, you kind of get stuck in your imagination. Or if you're at a party, you're imagining what people are thinking about you, or you're imagining what's going to happen next, or there's always something. You're almost like kind of really in your head more than you are in this kind of the sensual or sensory experience of the moment, just exactly the way it is, without your mind trying to project and shape it the way it thinks it should be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. So carry on, because this is so interesting and so important. And I think you have dropped so many really nuggets here that are just so profound. I told you, everybody, I said this is going to be very profound and a very rich perspective. And it comes from so much experience that you have in both the clinical and the Buddhism, and also, your personal experience. So it's really, really fantastic how you've come to these 8 points. And I'm really excited just listening to you sharing them with us. So please continue.
Yeah, I have to say that I know this is dense. There's a lot of information. And I don't know that the audience has to like memorize everything, but if it plants a seed, and then in the future you find yourself just like kind of always believing things that you like, why did I believe that? Or why am I so caught up in my mind, and I can't really enjoy a party because I'm just so, if you think, oh, I heard someone talk about tunnel vision. I'm like, oh, that. And so we'll talk a lot more about that.
Yeah.
So the 800-pound gorilla. So you can see all these things so far lead to some type of unhappiness or stress or struggle or even suffering, because you lose control. You're kind of easily influenced by others. It's like you're being pulled around by a chain, and your world seems smaller. You feel like life can get stale because you feel like there are a few choices. But the 800-pound gorilla, I think, in terms of a Buddhist sense of it, which a lot of this comes from Buddhism, although it's not detailed quite like this, is that your sense of who you are, your sense of self, what's been called an ego, not the Freudian ego, but the sense of like who you are, a sense of I, me, me in the world. That sense of you starts to get inflated with tunnel vision. And that can look like a lot of different things. For instance, with an inflated ego, you might take things personally that are not personal at all. And that has to do a lot, with being sucked into your imagination, and your imagination has a lot to do with your ego and your sense of self. And so I don't know if you've ever taken things personally that are not meant to be personal, like someone may look,
Never.
I think I do it all the time, and I've been meditating for 43 years and practicing this. So we're all human, and survival wiring is powerful.
Yeah.
So some other ways that ego can look is that you think of an inflated ego, you think of people feeling superior to others, which is absolutely a true thing. That you can, you might see people who are, you think your imagination tells you are less, or lesser, or they're, or you feel sorry for them. So there's a You can feel there's a sense of superiority, but on the other hand, paradoxically, and even at the same time, there's even inflated ego also means a sense of inferiority, like you're lesser than people. And when you really get into like crisis level of tunnel vision, you can feel like you're the worst person on the planet. Like there's no one, you're just like a horrible person. And the other thing that's I find very fascinating is that with inflated ego, with a inflated sense of self, you can feel very self-conscious, like people are looking at you and, you're in the party and they're watching you. And that's part of what goes into your imagination. But at the same time, or maybe even at different times, you can feel like you're in the outside looking in. Like you go to a party or you're looking at someone's house during a holiday and their lights are on, you feel like they must be happier than you are. Their life is more ideal than your life, or everybody is living more perfect life than you are. So, and the inflated ego makes you very competitive. And it makes you compare things constantly. You're comparing yourself to other things. Am I happy enough? And so it leads to like a never-ending, like an insatiable desire for the next moment to be better than this moment.
Yeah, I want to talk about that for a moment because I really love that you touched into this comparison and competition because we are in the Thought Leader podcast. And so a lot of times while you're building a business or an image or any type of persona with your branding, your positioning, your marketing, they talk a lot about competition, and there's a lot of comparison that happens in that realm. So it would be interesting to explore how does that show up in the professional world, because I think that there's a lot, personally, I believe that there's a lot of personal suffering that comes from, a necessary meshing of those concepts.
Yeah. So it's not, so if you're, so, it really would help to talk about the opposite of tunnel vision, which is perspective.
Let's do it. Yeah, let's do it.
We haven't finished totally talking about tunnel vision yet, but when it comes to like comparing and competing, it's like it's with tunnel vision, it controls you. Like you just really feel like in some ways you can't stop because it is that powerful survival wiring. It's like, if this food tastes good, there must be better food out there. And and so this no food is good enough, or I know I'm using a lot of food examples today. Yeah. But it's, and in a business, you're comparing yourself to other businesses that are successful. And that's, you don't lose your ability to think. It's just that with perspective, you don't get controlled by it. It's not grabbing your attention so much, so that you can still live in the moment. You can still be grateful for the moment and for what you have while also comparing. Does that make sense or answer it?
Absolutely, 100%. And I think that's a really important distinction to make. And yeah, it really explains how you can do also what you shared earlier, how you can know your lived experience personally and professionally, and then have that perspective at the same time. Fabulous.
That's right. So let me just run through the other two super fast.
Yes. Take your time, please.
You've been listening to the Thought Leader podcast. At Thought Leader, we help experts, authors, executives, and entrepreneurs land the most credible and authority-building stages in the world to spread their message and their impact. If that's you, visit thought-leader.com and click on Schedule a Session to get started. Now back to this episode of the Thought Leader podcast.
Well, yeah, okay. It's going to take too long. So the other, the the most obvious, and maybe it's even part of ego, is that an inflated ego distorts your thinking. So because you think you're right about everything, you tend to, you might catastrophize about the future and be sure you're certain, or it's like things have to be one way or another. It has to be, there's many ways that it can distort your thinking, and that you can find out even more details of that in like cognitive behavior therapy or cognitive therapy, where they kind of list kind of irrational thoughts. But if you think about the cause of those irrational thoughts, when I did explore that, it has everything to do with an inflated ego. In the world being smaller and all the other aspects of tunnel vision. And the last aspect of tunnel vision in that, and it's, maybe it's part of being sucked into your imagination, is that you live more in the past and maybe living in the future than you are in living in now. So the past is the most sort of living in the future is also causes a lot of anxiety, but living in the past is very problematic, because people just, they can't get over the past. They can't mature. And so even like when we, there's like patients who are in crisis, they even act younger than they really are. They just it just makes you more mature. You start to, you project onto people now that you've known in the past, even if they're not that person. But if they remind you, you can react as if they're that person. And the believability part, kind of really locks it in. So those are the 8 aspects of tunnel vision.
Yeah.
I think are worthy of knowing.
Yes, absolutely. It's so powerful to know these things, because then they become kind of symptoms that we can look at and self-diagnose, I will say, right? And say, oh, maybe I'm in tunnel vision. And I can totally relate to your example of having a teen daughter, and even the first day of school for a child. I have four daughters, and I could think of thousands of examples in which I was worried about them, and I felt exactly what you said. My world became smaller physically and also virtually, I guess. But really powerful how visual you made it for us, and how we can look at the signs to know whether we're in tunnel vision or not. And will you do the same for perspective?
Well, so I just want to say that, children also go into tunnel vision. So, think of your daughter as going to school, and in their peer groups, they feel like really super self-conscious, like everyone's looking at them, they're comparing themselves. It's the cause of a lot of suffering. And even, I would say as a psychiatrist, when particularly when I have patients who attempted suicide and wound up in the hospital where I was working, and I would say, like, you have children, you have all these things going on. What were you thinking? They're like, I was not thinking. And then you talk to them about tunnel vision. They're like, oh my God, I was not thinking clearly. Everything was distorted. And, my world seemed, I have no choices. I had to do it, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's more universal. So the opposite is perspective, and I won't go into the details of it, but there are 8 opposite things. Perspective. The easiest way to describe perspective is to talk about what in the brain causes it. Because, the brain is wired so its attention can get grabbed and all those things. That's very almost, lower cortical kind of things. But the opposite happens in the brain because of one core function of the brain that is also different for us, I think, than even animals, is that we don't have one brain. We have two separate brains, and they each have separate awareness. And that's been shown by, studies where they had to split the connecting fibers because they had seizures. And So they know that each brain has different awareness. They have different preferences. They see the world very differently. But in humans, the interesting thing is that they are so able to focus on each other that that's what creates this sense of like awareness of awareness, or knowing that you know, or a sense of like a more acute sense of aliveness, or an understanding like, of awakeness. And so, I mean, that's kind of at the core, what I believe, even at the core of like enlightenment, is that when you stop being in tunnel vision, your brain automatically is able to focus on itself more, focus attention on itself. And when that happens, you start to kind of sort of wake up in a way, and you realize, like, for instance, like, oh my God, this is really happening. My life's not a dress rehearsal like my tunnel vision told me it was. Mm-hmm. And you start to realize this minute, this second that we're talking right now, Elena, is like this moment in our lives will never happen again. And how precious it is. And you start to have, it fills you with a very intense sense of gratitude and appreciation, and as well as you start to experience the moment and your mind and your imagination and all the things more of as a totality, more as a whole, than like carved up into parts, which is what your tunnel vision tries to do. So that the moment becomes more of a whole moment that is intensified by this sense of presence or now. And so what perspective is that those two things, the ability to experience things as a whole, is very powerful because it gives you context, for instance. So say, for instance, I'm imagining, because this happens so many times, like a patient in a hospital is very threatening. And I've taught this to nurses a lot. So they will grab your attention, and then you start to project on them, and you get threatened, you start losing self-control, you do things you would normally do maybe. But if you can open awareness and be more present, then you see that person in context. You realize this is a suffering person, or this is someone, there's what's around you. Also, it's also, actually safety-wise, it's really very beneficial. But you start to see them, even a partner or a child who's pissing you off and they're grabbing your attention. If you can open up awareness, know you're in tunnel vision, or learn techniques to open awareness, you can see them more as like a suffering person, or you can see even where this came from. And the other, and another important thing about perspective is that you can hold two different paradigms, two different ideas in consciousness at the same time, so that you can, back to the teenager thing, because you can really start to hate, your teenagers. It's possible. Many people do get so angry, but you can also see them as a developing older child that they are, or as a suffering person, or, you can see your good mother and the bad aspects of your mother at the same time, or of, anything or any person, any event. It allows you to have, that gives you wisdom. It gives you maturity. And, if you think of all the 8 opposite things of perspective, you have a greater sense of self-control. You have, you are hard to hypnotize. The more perspective you have, you're less likely to accept things as true. It's not that you're like super skeptical, but there's always a little bit of doubt. It's a term in Buddhism called, having great doubt. And all the opposite things, you're not so sucked up into your head that you can really literally feel the moment in your skin and in your eyes and your ears. You have more of a sensory sense of what it's like to be here and now, and your ego gets greatly deflated, so that you almost it gets to a point where nothing is personal. It's all about the other person. and, that sense of comparing and competing, it's like there's still a drive there, but it's not consuming. Like, you can be in a game and you can enjoy being in the game and being competitive without taking it so personally that it ruins your whole time, and you ruin it for everybody else because you're so angry, So that's, in a nutshell, perspective.
Oh, I love it so much. And I love how you talked about the maturity and the wisdom that come from this approach. If we can call it an approach, right? State, maybe this state.
Oh, yeah. Well, yes. I mean, I would point out to you that there are obviously levels of tunnel vision. I call out crisis level of tunnel vision. There's toxic level of tunnel vision where you're stuck in a personality trait and you can't get out of it. There's dysfunctional tunnel vision. There's also cultural tunnel vision, where the culture literally says, go out and compete and buy this and don't buy that and compare constantly. So we're all exhausted with our cultural tunnel vision. Well, there's also degrees of perspective. There's simple perspective. There's more, philosophical perspective, all the way to sort of a enlightened or transpersonal or, non-dual perspective. Which is not, when you understand that it's not that non-dual or egoless, it's not that weird. The more perspective you can have, the happier you will be. And what that includes is not just maturity and wisdom, but also it gives you a greater sense of humor about life. It's like you can laugh things, you see irony. It also, I don't know, it just seems to bring up a sense of love and empathy, because your ego is not constantly getting in front of you and other people. So you feel more connected, you feel more belonging. It brings out creativity because you can see each moment fresh, spontaneity, which replaces impulsivity. So it's everything. When you hear people say, happiness comes from within, I believe this is exactly what that means.
That's fantastic. And I love what you said about having that, enjoying the game, because I think that also is a great analogy for parenting, for leadership, for anywhere for life, exactly, to just
like
be
your own money, this money, it's like you can, like, okay, it's like it's all kind of
fantastic. And one thing that really resonated with me, I mean, all of this is just so beautiful. That's why I was looking forward to this conversation with you, Jeff, is that your experience is so rich in seeing a lot of people, a lot of cases. So this is not something that you just decided to share one day. You've seen so much over the years, and you've studied so much. So you have a perspective that has been really, really expanded. And so the question that I have for you after that is, okay, so you said you're not easily hypnotized, which is such a great thing. And if we're not so easily hypnotized, and we're also not skeptical about everything, a lot of people talk about how we need to be better critical thinkers. Is that what you mean, or is it different?
Yeah, I mean, so perspective ultimately, it's not a thought like, hey, I should think this way. It's an awareness. It's allowing your brain's natural awareness to open on its own, because it's not on tunnel vision. And then the thoughts come to you. The critical thinking dawns on you.
Yeah, that is fantastic. Yes, 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 yes. And so my next question to you is, I know that you were talking about how one person can go from suffering to fulfilled.
I know we don't have that much time left, so I'll just go through the 4 areas like very quickly. And so the first one doesn't take a lot of explanation. If you know you're in tunnel vision, you can't be in that much tunnel vision. That's just the awareness of it alone. will pull you out of it. It's enough to get you out of a crisis to a less tunnel vision state. And, and so I'll leave it at that. The second thing is that there are obviously skills or ways to allow your brain to see itself and let go of tunnel vision. And, the field of mindfulness is a big part of that, although I identified what's called brain shifting, which actually starts with just intentional awareness and then goes to detachment and, every different thing. So if you practice that every day, you're less likely to ever be in tunnel vision, just naturally, whether you know it or not. And then the third thing, which is very big, and I will just give it really short shrift here, is that your brain, I actually have a model here, your brain that is, if it's steeped in wellness, right? So physical, mental, social, cultural, meaning, your life organization, and then moral wellness and existential wellness, without going into what those are, you will naturally have perspective on without even thinking about it. For instance, if you're feeling, just in the physical realm, if you're feeling energized and relaxed, you're going to naturally not take things as personally. You're just, or if you have mental wellness where your issues, your personality, you're going to know when you're being dragged into things. Yeah. Same with, so, if you follow a moral code and you can stick with certain guidelines, you're going to be less likely to be sucked into tunnel vision, have more perspective. So that's the third avenue, is wellness. And we spend in a life club and even in the hospitals a lot of time talking about wellness, because I believe that if your brain is unwell, even physically unwell, it's very hard for it to have perspective. Many ways. And then the fourth way is really kind of fascinating. It's been known for thousands of years that crisis level of tunnel vision can sometimes be a springboard to great wide perspective and deep meaning and fulfillment in life. And it's really well known. I mean, if like, even like there's a blackout in New York City years ago and people stopped their habit of life and they just started to connect with people in really deep, meaningful ways. But even like veterans who've had their legs cut off in war will unbelievably say it was the best thing that ever happened to them. I had a close friend of mine in college who was paraplegic from a motorcycle accident. We used to, at those days, we used to carry him up the stairs. And I was like, how are you such a happy, loving person? And he's like, that accident was the best thing that ever happened to me. So crises can sometimes do that automatically. And also, as I said before, the more tunnel vision you're in, the easier it is to notice it. You see all those 8 facets just boom, like right in front of you, like a neon sign.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow.
That is, I know it's really dense, and that's why I wanted like a 6-month to a several year life club, or it's a 4-week curriculum now for intensive outpatients. There's a lot to get.
Yeah.
I think this is a guide to your brain and to your mind. And it's like, if you don't get the instructor's manual, you're kind of going to be flying blind.
I love that. Absolutely. Yes. Yes to manuals. And is the experience also practical, or do you have experiential exercises? How does that work with the curriculum?
Oh, with the hospital curriculum? Well, with the wellness, there's lots of strategies. With the hospital curriculum, it's really just because people are there not too long. It's really just doing a little bit of a deep dive into each aspect of tunnel vision and the opposite aspect of perspective. When you're in the partial hospital program or the intensive outpatient program, then there's a lot of like brain shifting strategies, and we meditate every day. And actually in the hospitals, tell you the truth, I take that back. We actually had 2 different meditation times where people could practice these brain shifting skills. So every day, 9 o'clock, a bell would ring and the announcement would come on. Nurses were asked to stop passing meds. People
Yeah.
were asked to speak in quiet voices, and patients were taught very basic mindfulness skills, same at 7 p.m. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
Absolutely, because I thought, not only you have this information, but you help people integrate it into their lives and apply it to their actual life experience. So that definitely answers the question. I'm so grateful for the work that you do. It's truly incredible, transformational.
can I just add one last point about wellness? Is that in terms of social wellness, it's I have books on the subject, and I have more coming out. But the the point is that, and you can go through a hospital curriculum or whatever, life club membership, but having people to help you and coach you and guide you and join you in the journey is invaluable. And so, it's really hard to spot your own tunnel vision, but it's also hard to just let it go because we're so motivated. It's so survival wiring. And so having support is very important.
Yeah. Oh, that was beautiful. Absolutely. So essential. Because we think that we can do it all by ourselves. Is that part of the tunnel vision?
Yeah, that's a great point.
Okay, I love it. Oh my goodness, thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you so much, Jeff. I would, just talk to you for 4 hours if I could. And our time is up, but absolutely, I have all of the information for Jeff in the show notes so that you can connect with him. You have his website, his social media platforms, and also how you can connect with him, and his bio, which is absolutely impressive and incredible. And just let us know what resonated with you and what takeaways you have from this. One last question, just to leave the audience with this thought. What do you believe the term thought leader means to you?
It's funny. I consider myself a thought leader. So, it's anyone who is thinking kind of outside the box or innovatively because they have enough perspective to be able to do that.
I love that. Thank you so much. You definitely are a thought leader. That's why I was excited to interview you in the Thought Leader podcast. And please, everyone, check out everything that Jeff is doing. He's incredible. And you just got a little tiny taste of everything that he covers in his books, in his work. And it's really been an honor. Thank you for your time. I appreciate you. See you again in the Thought Leader podcast.
That's it for today's episode of the Thought Leader Podcast. Visit our Thought Leader Talks YouTube channel to browse all episodes and show notes, and to continue the conversation. We love to hear your feedback, ideas, and success stories. And don't forget to subscribe for more expert information, insights, and inspiration. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Thought Leader Podcast with another relevant conversation you don't want to miss.